Welcome to Generative AI Futures, brought to you by ByteGoose AI. The conversation around generative AI, it always seems to circle back to scale. How big can we make these models? How capable? How fast?
Right.
But there's this persistent undercurrent, this elephant in the room, that really dictates where things are going. And it's basically the cost, the dollar sign.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We're demanding exponential growth in what these models can do, but we're just slamming into an economic wall.
Yeah.
Training them, deploying them.
Yeah.
It gets incredibly expensive.
We're hitting that point of diminishing returns, aren't we? Just throwing more compute, more parameters at the problem isn't sustainable.
Exactly. Brute force scaling, just making everything bigger, is becoming, well, prohibitively expensive. We have to get smarter about it. We need to move beyond just raw size and focus on maximizing efficiency.
Building that efficiency right into the architecture from the start.
Precisely. The challenge now is designing models that are still incredibly powerful, but are resource aware, baked into their very design.
And that right there is our mission for this deep dive. We're going to explore two really phenomenal breakthroughs that are trying to redefine efficiency, not just by trimming the edges, but by fundamentally changing how the model actually processes information.
That's right. We're looking at Mixture-of-Recursions, or MoR, which brings in this idea of adaptive computational depth.
And then we'll look at DeepSeek's answer, DeepSeek Sparse Attention DSA. It's their pretty radical solution to that crippling quadratic cost you get with long context windows.
So the plan is, first, we'll unpack MoR. We'll get into how it cleverly recycles parameters and, maybe more interestingly, how it lets individual tokens decide how much thinking time they need.
Adaptive thinking, okay.
Yeah. Then we'll pivot to DSA. We'll analyze that lightning-fast indexing mechanism they use, how it keeps costs manageable even when you're dealing with, say, 128,000 tokens.
Wow.
And finally, we'll bring it all together. Compare these two approaches, optimizing vertically, like depth and MoR, versus optimizing horizontally, the sequence length, like a DSA. See how these different strategies might shape the next wave of models.
Sounds great. Let's dive in. Okay, so Mixture-of-Recursions, MoR. To really get it, I think we need to start with its foundation, right? The basic recursive transformer. We hear constantly about these models having billions, even trillions of parameters. How does the recursive idea even begin to tackle that?
Well, the core concept behind recursive transformers is all about parameter sharing, sometimes called tying weights.
Okay.
So instead of having, say, 32 completely unique transformer layers, each with its own massive set of weights stored somewhere.
Right, which eats up memory.
Exactly. You define maybe just one shared stack of layers, let's call it the recursion block, and you apply that same block multiple times, effectively creating depth through reuse.
Ah, so you get the computational depth of a big model, but with the parameter footprint of a much shallower one.
Yeah. Precisely. You're achieving that deep computation cycle. But the actual physical size of the model, in terms of memory needed for weights, is much smaller. That's a huge immediate win for memory efficiency.
Oh, I see that. And you mentioned this pays off in training setups like FSDP, fully shorted data parallelism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
FSDP is common for training these giant models. It works by sharding the model parameters across all the GPUs in your cluster.
Splitting them up.
Right. Now, during a forward or backward pass, each GPU needs the parameters relevant to its part of the computation. So it has to perform what's called an all-gather operation, basically, fetching the parameters it needs from the other GPUs where they're stored.
And that all-gather, that sounds like a bottleneck. Lots of communication, lots of temporary memory usage.
It's a huge communication and memory bottleneck.
Yeah.
Now, think about a standard non-recursive model. You do that expensive all-gather for layer 10's parameters, use them once for layer 10's computation, and that's it for those specific weights in that pass. But in a recursive model, because the weights in that recursion block are tied and shared, you perform that costly all-gather once for the block's parameters.
And then reuse them.
And then you reuse those exact same gathered parameters for, say, nil iterations or your number of recursion steps. You're amortizing that communication cost over multiple uses.
Ah, okay. That makes a massive difference to training throughput, I bet. It makes these really deep computations more, well, financially feasible to train.
Exactly. It lowers the barrier significantly.
Okay, so the parameter efficiency is clear. But you touched on a limitation of the older recursive models, this fixed computation depth, NaRNAs. Every single token goes through the block nana times, no matter what.
Yeah, and that's the key inefficiency they have.
Yeah.
Seems, kind of wasteful, right? If a token is just punctuation or maybe a common word like the or a, does it really need, say, 4 full cycles of attention and feed-forward updates.
Probably not. Seems like overkill.
It was a huge missed opportunity for what we call adaptive compute. Why spend all that computation on easy tokens? And that's where MoR comes in. It's designed to merge that parameter efficiency we just talked about with adaptive token-level computation.
So getting the best of both worlds.
That's the goal. The real sort of genius of MoR is how it dynamically assigns different recursion depths to individual tokens. It tries to ensure that only the harder tokens, the ones that seem to need more processing, actually get that extra thinking time.
How does it make that decision? How does a token effectively say, okay, I'm good, or nope, need another round?
That decision logic is built right into the core unit, that recursion block we mentioned. So the block has the shared layers, yes, but critically, it also contains a lightweight router.
A router, okay.
At each step of the recursion, this router looks at the current state, the representation of every token that's still active, and it decides which ones need to continue to the next recursion step, up to whatever maximum depth knowledge you've set.
What does this router look like technically? Is it complex? Another big attention layer?
No, definitely not. That would defeat the purpose of efficiency. The MoR router is deliberately kept lightweight. Typically, it's just like a small linear layer. It takes the token's current hidden state, projects it down to maybe a single score or a few scores. Then there's a mechanism to select based on those scores. Keeps the overhead really low.
Smart. And the paper explored 2 main ways the selection works, right? Inspired by mixture of experts.
That's right. They looked at 2 routing strategies, expert choice and token choice.
Let's start with expert choice routing. The study suggested this one worked a bit better.
Generally, yes. In expert choice, think of the router at each step as the expert. It looks at all the tokens currently in play and decides which ones get to proceed. It literally selects the top dollar tokens, the ones with the highest scores from that linear layer, suggesting they need more processing.
Top K, so there's a fixed capacity. Dollar tokens. Only dollar tokens make the cut at each step.
Exactly. It's kind of competitive. If your token score isn't high enough to be in the top takeout at that recursion step, it gets dropped. It stops processing right there.
Wow. Okay. And this means the number of active tokens potentially shrinks as you go deeper into the recursion.
It progressively narrows the set of active tokens, and this has a really important side effect. Perfect load balancing. Because the system caps the number of tokens being processed at each step to tollers, the amount of computation needed at that specific recursion depth is fixed and predictable. No sudden spikes if lots of tokens suddenly seem hard.
But wait, if tokens are just being dropped dynamically like that, how do you keep the training stable? Doesn't that mess things up?
That's a really critical point they had to address. To make the router's decisions clean, you want it to strongly prefer the top dollars and strongly reject the others, not have scores all muddled in the middle. They use an auxiliary loss function during training.
An extra loss just for the router.
Yeah. This loss basically encourages the router to output scores that are close to 1 for the chosen top dollar tokens and close to 0 for the rest. It helps produce these sharp, almost binary routing decisions, which they found was essential for keeping the training stable when you have this kind of dynamic computation graph.
Fascinating. Okay, so that's the competitive step-by-step expert choice. How does token choice routing compare?
Token choice is much simpler, maybe too simple. It's a one-shot deal. Each token gets assessed by the router only once, right at the very beginning.
At the start.
Yep. Based on that single initial assessment, the token is assigned a fixed, predetermined number of recursion steps it must complete. That's its entire computational path, decided up front.
Okay, so that's like expert choice is checking the traffic map every few miles and rerouting if needed, while token choice is planning the entire cross-country drive before you even leave the driveway and sticking to it no matter what.
That's a great analogy, and you can see why the ablation studies likely showed expert choice performing better.
Because the token's needs might change.
Yep.
Exactly. Routing granularity seems really important. A token might seem easy initially, but after 1 or 2 recursion steps, maybe its context makes it much more complex. Or vice versa. Token choice can't adapt. It might force a token to do extra unnecessary work, or worse, cut its processing short because the initial guess was wrong.
Whereas expert choice reevaluates at every step.
Right. It keeps checking the token state, its residual vector, and makes a fresh decision. This allows it to give the token, hopefully, just enough computation, not too much, not too little. And the results bore that out. The paper mentioned expert choice achieved, noticeably better performance metrics like lower negative log likelihood, which directly measures prediction quality. Okay, so we've got the mechanics down. Let's talk about the payoff for the actual efficiency gains in practice. Beyond just reducing the parameter count, the really big win computationally comes from tackling that infamous quadratic cost of attention. Ah, yes, the total 2 problem, sequence length dollar. As dollar gets longer, the attention computation just explodes quadratically. How does MoR, with its adaptive depth, manage to chip away at that fundamental total $2 sequence length cost?
It does it by strategically shrinking the effective context size dynamically at each step. Remember, the attention mechanism, usually the most computationally hungry part, calculates similarity between all pairs of tokens in the context.
Right. But in MoR with expert choice routing, the attention calculation at, say, recursion step 4 only needs to happen among the tokens that survive the routing decision at step 3. If only, hypothetically, 20% of the original tokens are still active by step 4.
Then the attention calculation is only running on that smaller set.
Exactly. Instead of an $1 times $L matrix, maybe it's effectively $2 at $2. The computation focuses only on the tokens the router deemed critical enough to keep processing at that depth. That sounds like a massive computational saving. You're kind of getting a subquadratic cost-benefit for attention, but without using a typical sparse attention pattern like, say, local or strided attention. Did this come at the cost of model quality, though?
Well, here's the really interesting part. According to their results, under strict isoflop conditions,
Meaning, they gave the MoR model and a standard vanilla baseline the exact same total training compute budget, right? Same number of floating point operations.
precisely, like say 16.5 quintillion FLOPs for both. Under that constraint, the MoR models actually achieved superior performance.
Better performance for the same compute cost. How?
They showed lower validation loss, higher few-shot accuracy, for instance.
Yeah.
One result went from about 42.3% accuracy for the baseline to 43.1% for the MoR variant. And this improvement came directly from the parameter efficiency.
Ah, okay. So it's not that MoR itself is inherently smarter per FLOP, but because it needed fewer parameters.
Exactly. Because the MoR model used nearly 50% fewer parameters than the vanilla baseline in their experiments, it could process significantly more training tokens within that fixed 16.5 E18 FLOP budget.
They traded model size for more data.
Yes, they leveraged the architectural efficiency to basically get more learning done for the same computational price. That architectural cleverness led to a better final model for the same cost.
That's a fantastic return on investment for designing the architecture smartly. Okay, so training efficiency is clear. Let's pivot to inference time. The other huge memory hog, especially as we push context windows longer and longer, 64K, 128K tokens, is the key value cache, the KV cache.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The KV cache is essential for fast autoregressive decoding. It stores the key and value tensors for all the tokens you've already processed, so the model doesn't have to recompute them for every new token.
But yeah, with long sequences, that cache can just balloon, right? It can easily eat up more GPU memory than the model weights themselves.
Often, yes. It becomes the limiting factor for batch size and context length. So MoR, being recursive, needed its own strategies for managing this. The paper proposed two main approaches tailored to its structure.
The first one, recursion-wise KV caching, sounds like the most direct way to leverage the token dropping.
It's the more straightforward idea. If the router drops a token at, say, recursion step $3, then its corresponding key and value entries are also removed from the cache for any subsequent attention computations at steps drevels plus $1 plus $2 and so on.
So the attention at deeper steps only looks at the KV pairs of the tokens that are still active at that depth.
Correct. You're pruning the KV cache vertically, mirroring the compute path. It saves memory, definitely.
But the second strategy they proposed, recursive KV sharing, sounds much more aggressive and maybe more novel.
It is. It's a more radical approach. With KV sharing, the keys and values for all the preceding tokens are calculated and cached only during the very first recursion step.
Only the first step. But what about the deeper steps?
That single comprehensive cache generated at step 1 is then reused and shared across all the subsequent recursion steps, step 2, 3, 4.
Why? What's the benefit of caching everything just once at the beginning?
The primary goal here is tackling prefill latency and maximizing memory savings. The idea is the first recursion step sort of establishes the initial, complete understanding of the entire input sequence or prompt.
The prefill stage.
Right. By generating the full KV cache just once there and then simply reusing it, you dramatically reduce the memory footprint compared to potentially storing different versions at each depth. And crucially, for prefill, you might only need to run that single first recursion block to generate the cache, regardless of how many recursion steps the model might take during decoding. That could speed up the initial processing of a long prompt significantly.
Okay, hold on. Let me push back on that a bit. If you're only using the KV cache from the very first recursion step, aren't you potentially losing important information? The deeper recursion steps are refining the token representations, right? Aren't you ignoring those refinements in the context by sharing the initial cache? It feels like you'd have to take a performance hit.
And that's exactly the trade-off they investigated. You're right, recursive KV sharing does lead to a slight reduction in overall model performance. Things like perplexity or accuracy compared to the more complex, recursion-wise caching, where each step has its potentially refined view of the context.
So why do it? Why accept lower quality?
Because in many real-world deployment scenarios, GPU memory is the absolute bottleneck, especially if you're trying to run on, say, more cost-effective hardware or maximize the number of users you can serve concurrently, batch size. In those situations, a significant improvement in memory efficiency from KV sharing might make the slight quality dip a very acceptable trade-off.
It's a practical engineering decision.
Exactly. It's about optimization for the biggest constraint. A model that's, marginally less accurate but fits in memory and runs efficiently at scale can be much more valuable than a theoretically perfect model that constantly runs out of memory or requires vastly more expensive hardware.
Okay, that framing makes a lot of sense. You optimize for the bottleneck. So MoR gives us this powerful way to handle vertical efficiency layers, computation depth per token.
Precisely. And now, we pivot to a fundamentally different strategy. If MoR optimizes the vertical stack, DeepSeek's approach, DeepSeek's sparse attention, DSA, goes after the horizontal dimension. The sequence length, MoR.
Right. This is a key feature in their newer models, like DeepSeek v3.2x, which evolved from the v3.1 terminus model.
Yep, and DSA is all about tackling that 2-1-2 attention cost head-on, specifically for scenarios where you need the model to handle massive context windows, think 128,000 tokens or even more.
Okay, at that scale, 200-2 is just computationally brutal. You absolutely need a way to make the attention calculation subquadratic in practice, even if the underlying mechanism still feels like attention.
And that's exactly what DSA aims to do. It introduces this really clever, lightweight filtering mechanism right into the attention layer itself. They call it the lightning indexer.
A lightning indexer.
Yeah.
Sounds fast.
It's designed for speed. Its whole job is to very quickly scan the entire preceding context and identify just a small handful of tokens that are likely the most relevant to the current token being processed.
How does it do that identification so quickly? What's the mechanism?
It computes a simple score, let's call it euro-DAL, between the current query token, let's say euro-T, and every single preceding token in the context.
Every preceding token. But wait, comparing the query to all previous tokens, that still sounds like all-MoE complexity, doesn't it? How is that fast enough to be a pre-filter?
Good catch. Technically, yes. The number of comparisons is euro-2 tool. The lightning speed comes from how it computes those scores. First, it uses a very small number of dedicated indexer heads, let's say HA dollars, which is way fewer than the number of heads in the main attention calculation.
Okay, fewer heads means less computation.
Right. Second, the actual calculation is simplified. They use, for instance, the RILU activation function, which is computationally very fast, maybe sacrificing some expressive power for pure throughput. And third, and this is probably the most critical part for speed and efficiency, the entire indexer computation can be done in lower precision. They specifically mentioned using FP8.
8-bit floating point. Wow, that's low precision compared to the usual 16-bit or 32-bit used in the main model parts.
Exactly. Using FP8 dramatically cuts down the memory bandwidth needed and the raw computation required. It's a calculated gamble. You're using a very fast, potentially less accurate filter to find the needle in the haystack, relying on the main attention mechanism later to handle the fine details correctly.
Okay, so the indexer quickly calculates these low-precision relevant scores for all previous tokens. Then what? The fine-grained token selection step.
Yes, this is where the sparsity actually happens. Based on those index scores, one day says, the system doesn't compute attention over all tokens. Instead, it only retrieves the actual key and value vectors for the tokens that got the top K highest index scores.
Top again. But here, dollars is much, much smaller than dollars.
Oh, vastly smaller. So let's use your example. If $128,000 tokens, a full attention calculation involves roughly 22, which is over 16 billion pairs. But if DSA sets to color to something like, say, 2048,
then the main attention calculation only needs to consider 8 times a D interactions.
Precisely. Instead of 28.2, the complexity of the expensive part becomes effectively no way. In our example, that's $128,000 times 2048, which is around 260 million operations. Still a lot, but orders of magnitude less than 16 billion.
That's the difference between potentially minutes of waiting during prefill and maybe milliseconds. That's how they slash the cost in these super long context scenarios.
That's the core mechanism. It makes handling 128K context practical from a cost and latency perspective.
Now, the paper mentions they implemented DSA within their broader multi-latent attention MLA framework and specifically used the multi-query attention MQA mode. Why MQA? What's the constraint there?
It seems to be driven by hardware efficiency, specifically at the GPU kernel level. To get the best performance out of the silicon, you want to maximize the reuse of data you fetch from memory.
Okay.
MQA is structured such that each key and value vector that gets retrieved, based on those top index scores, is shared across all the attention heads associated with the current query token. This sharing pattern maps really well to how GPUs process data, maximizing throughput. If each head needed its own unique KD fetch, it'd be much less efficient.
Makes sense. Optimize for the hardware.
Okay, training. This seems critical. You have this fast, low-precision indexer making filtering decisions, but the main attention layer is doing the heavy lifting. How do you train the indexer to be good at filtering before the main model even learns to rely on that filter? Seems like a chicken and egg problem.
They address this with a really clever two-stage training strategy. It's crucial. Stage 1 is a very short, dense warm-up.
Dense warm-up, what happens there? For just a brief period, maybe only 1,000 training steps, which corresponds to about 2.1 billion tokens in their setup, the model operates with standard dense attention. No sparsity yet.
So full context for everyone.
Right. And during this stage, they freeze all the model parameters except for the weights of the Lightning indexer itself.
So only the indexer is learning during this phase. What's it learning to do?
Its goal is basically to learn to mimic the attention patterns of the main dense attention layer. It's like it's copying the homework.
How does it copy the homework? What's the signal?
They use a KL divergence loss. KL divergence is a way to measure how different two probability distributions are. In this case, one distribution is the output scores from the indexer. The target distribution is derived from the attention scores of the main, powerful, dense attention layer after some aggregation and normalization.
So the indexer is explicitly trained to make its cheap, fast, low-precision scores match the expensive, high-fidelity relevance pattern identified by the full attention mechanism.
Exactly. It learns the relevant signal first, while the main model still sees everything. That seems vital for getting the indexer properly initialized.
Okay, that makes sense. Then, after that short warm-up, they switch to stage 2, sparse training.
Correct. Now, the sparsity kicks in. The fine-grained token selection is activated. Only the top-dollar tokens, identified by the indexer, are actually used for the main attention calculation.
And now all the model parameters are unfrozen?
Yes. Now, the entire model, including the main attention layers and feed-forward networks, needs to learn how to function effectively, how to make good predictions, given only this sparse view of the context provided by the indexer.
So the main model adapts to the sparsity. Does the indexer keep learning too?
It does. They continue to train the indexer using that KL divergence loss, trying to keep its filtering aligned with what the main attention would have focused on based on the selected top K set. But, and this is a crucial detail, they detach the gradient from the indexer's loss calculation when updating the main model parameters, meaning the indexer learns to be a good filter based on its own objective, but the main model learns its language modeling task based only on the sparse context it receives, without its own learning process being directly influenced or potentially disrupted by the specifics of how the indexer is being updated. The main model just optimizes for prediction given the filtered input.
Okay, so we've really gotten to the weeds of two brilliant but quite different strategies for building efficiency. MoR is optimizing that vertical compute path, how many layers, how much thinking per token. DSA is optimizing the horizontal dimension, how much of the long context a token actually needs to see. Let's contrast these paradigms directly.
Yeah, they really tackle different bottlenecks. MoR is fundamentally an adaptive depth framework. Its core strength lies in reducing parameter count and training costs. It uses weight sharing, layer tying for parameter efficiency, and then dynamic skipping of those shared blocks for computational efficiency on easy tokens.
Its focus is finding the optimal thinking depth for each token.
Exactly. Whereas DSA is an adaptive context framework. It's laser-focused on solving the inference cost problem, particularly for those incredibly long sequences. It uses that Lightning indexer to make attention subquadratic, ensuring tokens only attend to the most relevant subset of the context.
So its focus is finding the optimal context subset for each token.
Precisely. This means MoR is potentially more valuable for organizations doing large-scale training runs, where the budget for compute and parameters is the main constraint. It lets them potentially reach the quality of much larger models for less cost.
While DSA is almost indispensable for teams deploying models that need to handle huge inputs like processing long documents, massive code bases, or extended chat histories, maybe 128K tokens or more where inference latency and cost per token are critical.
Right. The practical cost savings demonstrated by DeepSeek for DSA, especially as you get further into a long sequence during decoding, are really dramatic according to their reports.
Yeah, the benchmarks they showed indicated DeepSeek v3.2 XPLY, the one with DSA, massively cut inference costs compared to its dense predecessor, v3.1 Terminus. Both prefill and per token decoding costs dropped significantly, especially way out at the 128K token mark. DSA effectively removes that exponential penalty for context length.
It makes those scenarios viable.
MoR's trade-offs seem a bit different, though. It gets better quality for the same training FLOPs, which is great, but there's that complexity around training the router, using the auxiliary loss, and managing the capacity factor tellers.
That's a really important practical point for MoR, especially with the expert choice routing. Because they rely on that auxiliary loss during training to force the router into making sharp decisions based on a specific capacity dollars, it becomes quite difficult to change that capacity factor dollars after the model is trained during inference.
So you're kind of locked into the capacity you trained with.
It seems that way, yes. It limits your flexibility in deployment. If you suddenly want to handle more or fewer tokens per step to trade off cost versus latency. DSA, on the other hand, just provides this inherent reduction in the attention cost function, making its deployment complexity, at least in that regard, potentially more straightforward to manage.
That adaptive depth and more, though, the core idea, it does open up some fascinating possibilities for understanding how these models work, doesn't it? Thinking about latent reasoning.
Oh, absolutely. MoR is, in a way, implicitly measuring the complexity of the task a token is involved in by deciding how many recursion steps it needs. A token that consistently requires, say, 4 cycles might be involved in a more complex multi-step reasoning process than one that finishes after just 1 cycle.
So you could imagine a future where the router isn't just implicitly learning this, but maybe it's explicitly trained or guided, linking recursion depth to known complex tasks like, I don't know, multi-digit arithmetic or tracing dependencies in code.
That's a really exciting direction,
Yeah.
using the architecture itself to provide clues about the internal reasoning process.
And stepping back, both MoR and DSA highlight that sparsity is key to future efficiency, even if they apply it differently vertically versus horizontally.
Definitely. MoR uses sparsity in the computational graph by skipping layers. DSA uses sparsity in the attention matrix by filtering the context. And importantly, these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive ideas. You could potentially combine them.
Like a MoR model that also uses DSA within its shared recursion block.
Or even integrating other forms of sparsity.
Yeah.
MoR could potentially be enhanced with structured sparsity, maybe activating only certain pathways or subnetworks within the shared block depending on the token, further reducing computation. They seem like complementary paths to efficiency.
This makes me think about interpretability. We spend so much effort trying to understand these models, tracing causal pathways, finding circuits. How do these dynamic architectures mess with that?
Oh, they pose a significant challenge to many existing methods. Think about something like causal mediation analysis, CMA. It often relies on the assumption of a fixed computational graph. You intervene on, say, a specific neuron in layer 10 and see how it affects the output, assuming layer 10 always performs the same role.
Right. If I tweak layer 10 and the answer changes, layer 10 was important for that answer.
But in a MoR model, the path is dynamic. For one token, the effective layer 10 might be the second pass through the recursion block. For another token right next to it, effective layer 10 might be the fourth pass, or maybe it's skipped the block entirely at that point. The notion of a fixed layer 10 breaks down.
The causal pathway isn't static anymore, it's chosen on the fly, per token. So CMA, in its standard form, might not even apply cleanly.
It becomes much harder. You can't reliably trace a concept through a fixed sequence of layers if the sequence itself changes for every token. Understanding emergent behaviors that rely on interactions across multiple components becomes vastly more complex when the components involved are dynamically selected.
And DSA adds its own wrinkle with the indexer, right? We need to understand why that fast, low-precision filter decided certain tokens were relevant and others weren't.
Exactly. Since the indexer is trained somewhat separately with that KL divergence objective, its decision-making process might be a bit opaque. Is it making good decisions for the right reasons, or has it learned some weird shortcut? Interpreting the filter becomes as important as interpreting the main model.
This sounds like where other interpretability techniques, maybe like sparse autoencoders, SAEs, become even more critical. If we can't rely on the fixed layer structure, maybe we need to track the abstract features the model is using.
I think that's a very promising direction. SAEs try to find and isolate meaningful interpretable features within the model's hidden states, features corresponding to concepts, relationships, syntax, etc. In a dynamic system like MoR or DSA, maybe the key isn't tracking which layer is active, but tracking which features are active.
So if a feature representing, say, negation or causal link activates, that tells us something meaningful, regardless of whether the token went through 3 recursion steps or 4, or which specific subsets of context DSA selected.
Potentially, yes. If those features identified by SAEs are robust and consistently represent the same underlying concept, they could provide a more stable signal for interpretation, even when the underlying computational path is fluid and changing.
So these architectures, built for efficiency, are doing more than just saving compute and memory. They're fundamentally pushing us to evolve how we even study and interpret the complex reasoning happening inside these powerful models. Hashtag, hashtag, outro.
So wrapping things up, we've really taken a deep dive today into two very different but incredibly powerful approaches to building scalable AI. We saw a mixture of recursions, more rural, using architectural tricks like weight sharing and adaptive depth to achieve really significant efficiency gains, especially in parameter count and training costs.
Right, tackling that vertical complexity. And then we explored DeepSeek's sparse attention, DSA, which completely revolutionizes how models handle long contexts by using that lightning-fast indexer to dramatically cut the L2 cost of attention. This makes decoding sequences of 128K tokens or more actually practical in terms of throughput and cost.
Yeah, and taken together, these innovations really drive home the point that the future of large language models isn't just about getting bigger and bigger. It's about getting smarter, more efficient, more resource-aware in their very design.
The choice between these kinds of strategies, optimizing adaptive depth like MoR or optimizing sparse context like DSA, is likely going to define how models are built and deployed going forward. It really depends on what your main bottleneck is: model size and training budget, or inference latency and memory constraints for long contexts.
Absolutely, it highlights a shift towards more specialized, efficient architectures.
So let's leave our listeners with a final provocative thought to chew on. We've talked about more letting tokens decide how much they need to think via adaptive depth, and DSA helping them decide what context they need to remember via sparse attention. What are the deeper, maybe long-term implications for us trying to understand, debug, and ultimately trust these models when the very notion of a fixed computational pathway, the bedrock of many interpretability methods, is becoming entirely dynamic and decided token by token at runtime? How do we trace responsibility or reasoning in a system that truly thinks differently for every single input it processes?